Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Tushar, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the experiences that I've had in the community identifying as queer and some of the things that I've been trying to do and some of the resistance and some of the other things that a lot of us are really familiar with. So I love this slide, this first slide, because it conveys my exact expression and emotion whenever I come out as queer to people, because they generally question the validity of that statement as if, you know, they have a right over like what I identify as. It's interesting, and then I have to elaborate a little bit more, and I say that I identify as a queer gay person. And people are really puzzled about that. And I say, well, what I do in bed is very gay, and what I do outside of bed is very queer. And it's a very strange relationship that our community has had with the word. Coming from a third world country, can I get the next slide? Yeah. Coming from a third world country with a rich cultural history of gender and sexually diverse populations, which have been socially accepted or at least tolerated for a while, I found a lot of acceptance and a sense of community with the word queer, because it conveyed a lot of what I felt inside and outside. And it was also interesting because our identities didn't really conform to the LGBTQA plus to something like alphabet soup of things. And it was just an easy label. Well, it's funny because I call it a label, while the label queer for me actually means the absence of labels. It's ironic to an extent. But what's more interesting about this is the fact that what a lot of us in the East, or like basically not the West, had reclaimed a little bit quicker before it could become really bad, found a lot of resistance in traditionally Western movements and generally traditionally conservative movements. One side of the spectrum especially refuses to use the word queer as too radical, and it's generally seen in what we call the more proper movements. The challenge is that what happens after that is that they tend to dismiss those of us who come from that side. And don't get me wrong, our side or the other side, I'm taking no sides at this point. I'm saying that both sides are unwilling to talk to each other. So the conservatives don't talk to the radicals, and the radicals don't talk to the conservatives. While, of course, keeping in mind the history of how conservative movements have generally left behind people who don't fit into a very homonormative idea of like, let's all fit into society together. So when the conservative folks don't talk to the radical folks and the radical folks don't talk to the conservative ones, it causes a lot of trouble to those of us who are somewhere in the middle, who are trying to bridge that gap, and all definitely hurts our cause to build this common messaging, especially, and also builds on this very familiar sense of othering. You know, you neither belong here, and you don't belong there, and one side doesn't validate your experience and your activism, and the other side feels the same way about you. So how do we as a community come together, bridge these gaps, you know, fill in those cracks, address all the challenges that are happening between these two, and build a cohesive movement? The first step on that process is to understand the relationship between privilege and empathy. Generally, the more you're privileged, the lesser your empathy, because you generally tend to not understand the other person's perspective or understand the lived experiences because you don't have that idea. And we definitely need to build on that. And step one on that would be to actively recognize that privilege doesn't come in very recognizable forms of gender, race, sexual orientation, and privilege, but has a lot more to do with a person's very unique and very specific lived experiences. Assessing your privilege is not a one-time SWOT analysis that you personally or your organization can do, but is a recurring process that you have to keep doing every year, every single bit. And you have to ask yourself and your friends and your organization, who are we leaving behind? And if you don't get an answer, ask the people who criticize you, because they definitely have the answer. And then you can no longer tell yourself that you or your organization are very diverse, because clearly you forgot some people. Next slide. Pragmatism is not a bad thing. I mean, unless it leaves people behind. I do understand that the system is inherently racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic, but that doesn't mean that we need to stand there and criticize those who try to infiltrate it from within. Our movement has to work both from the outside as well as from the inside to ensure that we have systematic change, which accepts what we are trying to achieve. We also need to stop the othering process, thinking that no one else will understand. We've come a very long way in educating others about our issues, but the challenge here is we don't want to talk to anyone else, even within our movement, who doesn't believe in the same things that we do, and that is extremely wrong. Our journey is difficult, and it's critical to our work that we engage those who speak a different language, who speak a different idea of activism from us, and that needs to start from within our movement itself. We all exist on multiple spectrums of sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, sex characteristics, and we also exist on a very large spectrum of our political activism. For decades, certain portions of the spectrum were considered technically legitimate, and it delegitimized the other part. And the backlash from the radical queer movements against conservative movements is completely valid. But the challenge that this leaves us with is that we need to build alliances within us to form a collective front outside. Because unfortunately, and this is really ironic, our opposition actually unites us in the sense of a community, while we ourselves don't understand what our community is about. And that's something that is food for thought for everyone. Daniel, next one. Thank you. The symbol for equilibrium is a very interesting one. It shows two forces in opposition balancing each other out. But unlike chemistry, our queer rights movement, our LGBT movement, whatever you might call it, we need to come together from both sides of the spectrum, build each other up, and promote what would be a cohesive messaging to the outside. It should be a collective voice that represents all of us, not just the select few who our respective factions have decided as are legitimate to our cause. In a relationship, both sides need to walk the path and get to a middle ground. But unlike relationships, movements and their outlooks change as people change in our movements. But how many more years are we willing to dismiss the other end of the spectrum just because we think they're irredeemable? Because I don't think so. And for those of us who are in the midway space, we need to bring together the left and the right, the conservative and the radical, both sides of the brain's hemisphere together. We need to be like this little organ called the corpus callosum, which is the biggest mediator in our brain and brings them together. And till then, unfortunately, we'll keep on asking ourselves the question, am I too queer for here, or am I just not queer enough? Thank you.
Thank you, Tushar.